now we have Morten Jelby, who's going to speak on religion and rootedness, life in Nishida and Nishitani.
Indeed. First, thanks to Miguel for kind of setting the stage. I'll be talking a bit about, I'll at least touch upon contradiction, and I don't think that we will have the same perspective on that, but I'll just get right to it. And I'll be talking about religion and rootedness, life in Nishida and Nishitani, or at least that's the title of my presentation, but I'll have to say that I have to make a delimitation with regards to Nishida. I'm not going to be speaking much about Nishida due to time constraints, simply. In recent years, the question of life has taken center stage in French phenomenology, especially in Renaud Barbaras's asubjective phenomenology. Barbaras often refers to the double meaning of the term vivre in French. It does not only have the transitive meaning of being intransitive meaning of being alive, but also the transitive sense of experiencing something. Vivre can both mean bodily being in the world, and it can mean being conscious of something. But the question is, if we do not precisely lose sight of life by thus splitting it in two, in worldliness and consciousness along the lines of a Cartesian dualism. These two meanings, Barbaras argues, are, and I quote, are derived from the primordial sense of living, which is precisely neutral with regard to the distinction between the transitive and the intransitive, end quote. Inquiring into the mode of being of life thus means posing the question of the mode of being that can account for the rootedness of consciousness in the world. More fundamentally than the eidetic abyss that separates the Erlebnisse from the world. That's, of course, Husserl's Ideen, paragraph 49. There must be an ontological continuity between Leben and Erleben, between our being a living organism in the world and our being conscious. The uprooting of our Erleben under the form of a self-sufficient consciousness makes our openness to the world unintelligible, and the task at hand, that of grasping life as rootedness in the world, is consequently a phenomenological task. We can draw this conclusion from Nishitani's assertion that through the scientific worldview, which reduced the world to dead matter, I quote, each individual ego became something like a solitary island floating in a sea of dead matter, and inevitably came to close itself within itself, end quote. The isolation of consciousness means its closing upon itself as an interiority in which the things are only present as shadows of themselves, that is, as representations. In the citadel of the self, we are cut off from the suchness of the things. In short, the standpoint of consciousness is naivete. In short, the standpoint of consciousness is a naivete, the root of which is to be found in the eviction of life from the world. We could thus, in the words of Hans Jonas and Barbaras, speak of an ontology of death which becomes prevalent in modernity, and which is the root of the separation of body and consciousness. Through the scientific worldview, Nishitani writes, life was extinguished in nature and natural things, and the living bond flowing at the bottom of man and things disappeared. In the pre-scientific worldview, the idea of life as such a living bond was central. Not only man, but all living beings pertained to one big tree of life, end of quote. We must therefore, in our inquiry, cast light on the cause of this naivete of the ontology of death. And if we are to understand life in its fundamental unity and thus gain a grasp of phenomenality, we'll have to uncover a way to neutralize this naivete, an hypoké, so to speak, which will open the path to overcoming the metaphysical dualism of modernity in an archaeology, we might say, of the ontology of life which pertained, according to Nishitani, to the pre-modern worldview. As we can see from the quote, it is only in this way that we can find a symbiosis with other forms of life. a philosophy of rootedness is, indeed, a challenge to the idea of man as an exception among the living. Of course, although Nishitani serves as the guide for our question, this overcoming of modernity was already prepared in the fundamental concept of the Kyoto school, namely Nishida's pure experience. The paradigmatic change that we can see in this concept is, in my opinion, the liberation of phenomenality with regard to the subject. It communicates the insight that experience is more fundamental than the subject experiencing. As Nishida writes, it is not that there is experience because there is an individual, but that there is an individual because there is experience. End of quote. What we're presented with here is, to paraphrase Jan Patočka, phenomenality in its absolute autonomy. Plato in Europe, chapter 3. Phenomenality in its absolute autonomy. Phenomenality is only in experience, phenomenality not only in independence from the object, an independence, of course, which we gain through the Husserlian reduction, but in a more radical fashion, this is an independence of phenomenality with regard to the subject also. This allows Nishida, under the inspiration of Bergson, no doubt, to open a path for a conception of the world as a process of phenomenalization, at the foundation of which there is a unifying will, a force. What allows for this desubjectivation of phenomenality, I would argue, is the following fundamentally different point of departure between Nishida and Husserl. To Husserl, constitution must necessarily be founded on fullness. The Erlebnisse are given adequately in reflection, and this sets them apart from transcendent being, which is always given inadequately. In other words, the Erlebnisse immediately fulfill the act of immanent perception, whereas the world is intended in an empty manner. This is why phenomenology takes a turn towards transcendental idealism and subjectivism in Husserl. Pure experience, on the other hand, is empty and thus opens another path to us. It is pure because, as the a priori of all objectivity, it is devoid of the distinction which pertains to the objects. Both Nishida and Nishitani often illustrate this fundamental givenness by speaking of the color in general, which transcends all distinctions of colors. Tsunabe is indeed perceptive when, in his first article on Thetic Judgment, he illustrates pure experience through the example of our eye melting into the stream of consciousness as we are absorbed in looking at the sky. Only the clear blue sky remains, he writes. Indeed, the example is well chosen, as the sky is a perfect illustration of a pure transcendence, all-enveloping and consequently empty. And this emptiness, as far as its objectivity has fallen away, is nothing else than the pure duration which flows at the foundation of consciousness. But we could say that the whole challenge is concentrated here, namely, in the question of how to understand the unity of the pure transcendence of the sky, devoid of any ontic trappings, and the dynamicity of this flow at the foot of consciousness. This idea that the intuition founding both subjectivity and reality is not a fullness but an emptiness is the fundamental deviation between a phenomenology of consciousness, such as Husserl's, and what we'll call a phenomenology of life. How does this emptiness open up a path for conceiving of an ontological continuity between the subject and the world? Already in his texts from the 1920s, Nishitani, to whom we now turn, tries, through Schelling's philosophy, read in the light of Bergson, to overcome the distinction of subject-object, or the dualism between the infinite, the idea, and the finite, that is, the real. Their opposition supposes a foundation which envelops their distinction. In other words, an infinite of the infinite, or an idea of the idea. This is, of course, also we could say an image of the absolute nothingness, which transcends the distinction between being and nothingness. Right? So this idea of the idea is none other than an acting at the foundation of all acts, a dynamicity which cannot be objectified and fixed. So we can say that the idea of the idea has two aspects. It is the transcendental perception, a pre-reflective givenness of all acts, a subjectivity which escapes all acts of reflection, and at the same time, it is that which is the most universal, the most enveloping, a pure horizon, in a way, the sky or the world, at least in a Patochkian sense. In the 30s, Nishitani will explain this all-enveloping nothingness as life. Life is a force, a dynamis, from which all living beings are born. The living is, at the same time and indistinctly, a realization and a negation of life. Life, as the universal of the living, only becomes manifest through the distinction of the particular living. Like the Sein des Seienden, Sonzai-shan or Sonzai-se, life presents itself in the living to the extent that it conceals itself. Life absents itself from its presentation, that is, from the living. Its mode of being is an irreducible excess with regard to itself. Its mode of being is thus to be found in the rejection of all fullness and identity. So we get to a contradictory form of being, of course. Nishitani will in Shukyoto Ananika speak of the suchness of the fire by explaining that the fire is not fire, and therefore it is fire. This mode of being, that is emptiness, indeed applies to life as such a natura or a physis, which always withdraws intact and undiminished from that which comes about through its negation, that to which it gives birth. As life thus presents itself as a lack rather than a fullness, it is entirely inobjectifiable. As Nishitani writes, life being perceived as object is the death of life. But this precisely means that life is inevitably alienated from the objectifying standpoint of consciousness, in which, as we saw, consciousness has closed the representations of the things within themselves, within itself. Nishitani writes, the mark of the opposition of object and subject, or an external opposition, an external position, is precisely the so-called representation. When the isolated ego sees everything from the outside as object, representation becomes the content of the act of the ego. End of quotation. If this is so, it is only through the emptying of the representations that we can let life appear as emptiness. But emptiness, as we now understand, does not mean the mere absence of content. It means differentiation as a mode of being. It means dynamicity as unity of negation and realization. This emptying of consciousness does not only mean that life can manifest in its true form. As we just saw, there is no external perspective on life. So on the contrary, by being emptied, consciousness itself is overcome as consciousness. It is reduced to the emptiness of life, that is, it is brought back to its true mode of being. It is in this sense that life can appear, only at the root of subjectivity, or rather, as its rootedness, the continuity of the dynamicity of the physis and the dynamicity at work at the foundation of subjectivity. To overcome subjectivism is thus not simply to negate or jump out of consciousness, but rather to go through its bottom, to radicalize it, so to speak. The so-called standpoint of emptiness is, consequently, where we find the continuity between Leben and Erleben. This emptying of the subject is the Eckartian Entbildung. The empty character of life is one with its infinity. It is not merely the life of this or that living being, but must be the life of all lives, as Augustine says of God, and Nishitani quotes him repeatedly. Here, a phenomenality of life, as rootedness, shows itself to converge with a philosophy of religion. The standpoint of emptiness, where we find a continuity between world and subject, is to Nishitani what characterizes religion. Indeed, it is only by understanding the life of all lives, that is, indistinctly God and nature, as radical subjectivity, that subjectivity can pertain to the world. But we must immediately distinguish this religion from the ordinary understanding of this term. The gate to religion, Nishitani writes in What is Religion, is the great and profound doubt, which he contrasts with the Cartesian methodological doubt. Indeed, the Cartesian doubt, as we know, negates the world but affirms the doubting subject. It precisely splits the living insofar as its result is a residue, a remainder which is beyond doubt. The great doubt essential to religion, on the other hand, suspends the being of the subject itself. It reveals its being as emptiness. It reveals the self on the mode of the all-enveloping life which flows at the bottom of man and all things, that is, as an inexhaustible excess. In phenomenological terms, we could thus speak of religion as an asubjective epoché, a radicalized epoché which suspends not only the thesis of the existence of the world, but also the being of the subject, revealing a pure transcendence which we can indistinctly call the world or God. This is where life, that is, the life of all lives, is revealed in its truth. Religion should therefore not be understood as a certain belief, not even the belief in a God. As an act of consciousness, belief only relates to the image, that is, the representation of God, revealed to the creature. Such a belief is precisely the objectivation of life, which, as we saw, is the death of life. Religion as belief is, we must conclude, the negation of true religion, in which, through the evacuation of the subject, our being is revealed in continuity with the emptiness that is God. It is in this sense that Nishitani can write in a text from 1954 that religion is life itself. Only religion understood as a radicalized phenomenology is life to be found in its primordial unity of Leben and Erleben, a rootedness in the world. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, so Q&A. Sorry. Yes, please. Yes, please.
Easy question, I hope, because everybody must be very excited. So, if religion, according to Nishitani, is this most fundamental, like this deepest epoche in which I don't even believe, I don't even assume even myself as a subject, does he differentiate between religion and philosophy? So, how does he elaborate this difference? So, is it about maybe exposition rather than just experiencing it, or some other way? That's my question.
Yes, I believe that he does see religion as I understand it. He basically reduces philosophy to a thought of being or of nothingness, one that still pertains to the distinction of the two. And so basically, Bernard Stevens, who has translated the Shukyoto Nanika into French, notes how the original title of this work might refer to was ist Metaphysik, right? That it's in a certain sense an echo of this title, so a response to the Heideggerian understanding of metaphysics, in the sense that here we still have a nothingness which doesn't overcome the problem of representation, right? It doesn't entirely the nihility of this metaphysics doesn't entirely overcome the standpoint of the subject. And so what he tries to do by the concept of ku, of emptiness, is to, we might say, radicalize and de-objectify this nothingness that there is in Heidegger, which is still too objective, and understand thus not only nothingness as something towards which we are, but the mode of being of the subject itself, or not nothingness, of course, insofar as that is still opposed to being, but of course to empty out the being of the subject at the same time as that of the world. So religion here, I could say in a word, is a radicalization of philosophy insofar as it throws away the last presuppositions of ontological presuppositions.
Well, while you're thinking, I have a question to both speakers. So,
You only have one microphone.
I only have one microphone, but it's to both speakers. There's a phrase in Hegel's phenomenality where Hegel says, when reason speaks of another, in fact, it only speaks of itself. Such that Hegel starts with a really exciting move, namely the productive negativity that is productive of positions. So everything is what it is because it is not something else, which is where he seemingly breaks from the classical Western ontological tradition that is based on an ontology of self-identity. Something is because it is self-identical to itself. But then, of course, he sublates the opposition into a higher ontological identity. And this movement continues until you get to a position where you have substance as subject. So it's never really a real opposition. There is no real alterity in Hegel, in a sense. And this is a critique I don't think I'm making. I think other people have maintained this critique. Nishida's critique of Heidegger is that there's no thou, no outside. And so, to both of you, I'm curious about the relationship of the thou, a radical alterity, a life center that is beyond my life center. In the Levinasian sense, I am responsible for a time that is not my own, but one that is not just a projection of my own subjectivity, and therefore just a sort of a negative, inverted image of myself, and not I, which would be therefore the distinction between life, death, and that type of opposition, but one that is a radical, immanent transcendence that is the base of this contradiction. I did not sense that you're grasping, you're parsing out of the contradiction, is able to have this immanent transcendence to a position that cannot be inscribed in a system of understanding. And also I would wonder, your definition of religion, or Nishitani's definition of religion, seemed to go to a place where that relationship to an alterity or relationship to a thou seemed to be extinguished. Now I might misunderstand both of you, so my question to you both is the logic of opposition, the contradictory self-identity, include a thou in your thinking? If not, why? If so, why didn't we hear it?
Do you want to go first?
You can go first.
I'm really Nishida, so okay. So my quick answer would be, well, because it was a presentation on early Nishida, and the I-Thou relationship was pretty like middle period, right? Now Nishida is, I believe, consistently subscribes to immanence theory. So even when he's talking about, which means pretty much that nothing transcends the world, which is pretty much the whole point about him constantly talking about the world having a self-aware structure. The point being that the world reflects itself onto itself, so there is nothing that needs to determine it externally, right? It's a kind of an, I think, altogether, what would you say, introverted picture of the world. But of course, like I am studying early Nishida, I've been doing that for 12 years, and I've never really gotten a grasp of the middle period or the late period yet. So, so the reason why, to reiterate the short answer, the reason why you don't find the Tao in at least early Nishida is because he evidently subscribes to immanence theory, that nothing transcends the world. The world is only unto itself. hence Josiah Royce and stuff. I also do not believe that actually Hegel is breaking with the Western ontological tradition. When he's talking about identity, he's talking about the essence of a thing, right? That which makes a thing, right? Now, the way essences are determined in Aristotle is always through specific difference, right? There is, like the famous example being man is a rational animal. So there is a specific, so there is the genus, animal, and within that there is something that distinguishes man from other animals, which is reason, right? So I believe that he's just giving a really ontological interpretation of the way essences are defined in Aristotle.
I would agree with you, but that's what I said.
Yeah.
He starts out as if he's going to break from that tradition, but then he falls right back to it, and so there is still no exterior. So the logic of contradictory self-identity doesn't really still have a place in early Nishida would be my follow-up question, I guess.
I don't think so. Not in early Nishida.
I was a little confused there. And so
I'll keep it really short. I'd say that this alterity pertains to the living, not to life. To the living beings, which are differentiated, but in their motto, they're the same. In their foundation, their home ground, as the English translation has it. Is this life of all lives?
And could not the historical world or the world of form be the alterity of life? The formed world, formed life that becomes the Leibniz, the life-centered. The form that gives that structure, is that not life's alterity, and does not life then express itself through the alterity of form?
Well, there is an alienation, right, from life, and if I understand it correctly, in the standpoint of consciousness.
But why call it alienation? Why not call it realization?
Well, the realization is certainly in the living beings. However, the standpoint of consciousness, in which there is an objectivation, this objectivation is not as I quoted, the death of life, and so an objectifying view on the world. And here we could also speak, of course, of this applies actually to the Husserlian idea that the world, that there's a thesis of the world that can be suspended. If we make a thesis of the world, we're postulating it, and that is, we're postulating it as objective in a certain sense, right? So life is beyond this objectivation, and thus the objectivation is simply something that conceals it in this, basically in the same way as there's a forgetfulness of this idea of the idea, in the same way as in the Platonic cave. And so the turnaround that there is in religion, or forgetfulness of Sein, when we're just dealing with the beings, right? Zionist. So the turnaround, the anamnesis that there has to be in religion, the gnothiseuton, you might say, of religion, brings us back then not to a world of ideas, but something that transcends the world of ideas, and therefore not a true being, but the true nothingness, the true emptiness, which is beyond all of that, and which is forgotten, which is concealed through this fixation or solidification of life in objectivity.
Okay, it's 6:30. Last question opportunity. The last question of the day. Everyone wants to go for a beer or a nihonshu. Online?
No, we don't have anything.
No, we're good. Well, join me in thanking our two speakers.